Okay, now let's look at an example of refactoring. So for this, we start with a new use case to the library system and then come up with a design and implementation for that. At this point, we are not talking about refactoring, right? We are actually changing the functionality. We are adding a new use case. So no refactoring here. We will implement that and then take a look at what we have implemented or at least designed, and then apply refactoring rules to get a better design and implementation. So at this point, I want to emphasize that we don't introduce refactoring. We are introducing a new use case using which we can show what refactoring is. Okay, this new functionality imposes fines if a book is returned late. So this library collects fines from users who return books late. So let's see what the use case is for returning a book. Member arrives at the return counter with a set of books and gives the clerk the books. So I'm basically reading this, nothing else. The clerk issues a request to return books. So we have the return books use case, but modified. The system asks for the book ID. The clerk enters the book identifier. Now, up until now, there was no real difference between the original return book and this, right? But now we are going to have to see that we have new functionality. If the book ID is valid, mark that the book has been returned and informs the clerk if there is a hold placed on the book. Again, this is the same as before. In case of an invalid ID, notifies the clerk that the identifier is not valid. No change here either. But now we can see that we are adding more functionality. If there is a fine, that is if the book is late in returning, it computes the amount of fine and adds it to the user's account. So the user has a running total of the fines accrued and displays the amount of fine and information about the member. And then, as usual, it asks if we should be issuing the return, we should be handling the return of another book. And this goes as before. All right. How do you design and implement this? Let's look at the sequence diagram, which is not all that different from before, but there is something new. So given the book ID, it searches for the book and gets the member who had the book issued. Now we are doing something more here. You need to know whether this book was returned late. So we need to know the due date, which is from the book, which is in the book object. And we also need to know what today's date is. That can be, of course, gotten from the system. And this can be used to compute the fine. But we will add some interesting twist to this whole thing. We want to charge the fines differently if the book is more recent. If the book was acquired in the last 1 year, we need to charge more. And we also need to double the fine if the book had a hold. So let's look at this. So we need to know when the book was purchased. So we need to have the acquisition date for every book stored in the book object. So that is returned from by the book object through this get acquisition date. So if the book is overdue, see this guard If the book is overdue, we call the get acquisition date from the library on the book object to get the acquisition date. And we compute the fine within the library and add the fine if the book was overdue. Okay, that is extra stuff here. Here is the overall flow of return book in the revised or further revised use case. We get the book and member references, get the due date. We also need to get the acquisition date. This is all from the sequence diagram. We need to compute the fine. We need to record that the member has returned the book. You need to add fines to the member, check if there is a hold, and return a result if there is a hold, fine, etc. So this is roughly the pseudocode corresponding to the sequence diagram. Let's now refine this further and look at the Java code. This is stuff that we have already seen from the previous version. We search for the book and we search for the member, or rather get the member from the book. So we search for the member here, for the book here, and the book tells you who returned or for to whom the book was issued. Now we have the code for computing the fine. Double fine equals 0.0, and that is initially the fine is supposed to be 0. Then we get the due date from the book. Then we check what is the current time in millis and is it more than the due date. If so, this was returned afterwards, after the due date. So we know that there is going to be a fine. And we get the acquisition date. And if the acquisition date and the due date are more than 1 year apart, we charge the user 15 cents for the first day that it is late and 1 cent for, or we can change it to 5 cents, whatever, it doesn't really matter, for all days elapsed. I think I mistyped this. Maybe this should have been 5. And otherwise, we charge 25 cents if it is a recent book. That is, the book was acquired in the last year. We charge 25 cents for the first day and 15 cents for all days elapsed. And if the book has a hold, we double the fine. If the book was not returned, if the book didn't get returned on time only, we do this stuff. If the book was returned on time, fine would remain 0. We have the methods year apart and days elapsed since here. Given 2 dates, this will subtract or find the difference between their corresponding milliseconds elapsed since the reference time, divide by this number, which is the number of milliseconds in a year. You have 86,400, rather in a day, 86,400 seconds in a day. These many milliseconds, you're multiplying the number of seconds by 1,000 and divide that by 365. That is not perfect calculation, but that is good enough for our purposes, because we just want to illustrate the idea of refactoring. We don't have to get the exact numbers to understand what refactoring is all about. And this is the number of days elapsed between today and this date. Then the final few steps of return book would be calling member.return book as before. And if the fine is more than 0, then add that fine to the members running total of fines. And if the book has a hold, return that information that the book has hold and a fine. If the book doesn't have a hold, return the code book has fine. If the book has a hold, return book has hold, otherwise you return operation completed.